The morning my son told me I would receive nothing from my ex-wife's will was the morning I realized how quietly a family can fall apart. It happened over coffee. The sun had barely risen, and the kitchen window was glowing with that soft golden light that makes ordinary mornings feel peaceful. I was sitting at the small wooden table I had owned for 30 years, the same table where my son, Daniel, used to do his homework when he was a boy. Back then, his feet didn't even reach the floor. Now he sat across from me as a grown man in his 40s, dressed in a sharp gray suit, tapping impatient fingers against his phone screen. I remember thinking how strange it felt that he seemed more like a visitor than my child. "Dad," he said without looking up, "I should probably be honest with you before we go." I lifted my coffee slowly. Honest about what? He finally met my eyes, but there was something missing in them. Warmth, maybe. Or patience. "The will," he said plainly. "Mom's will." The word mom still carried a quiet weight in our family, even after the divorce 22 years ago. Margaret and I had not ended things dramatically. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a slow fading of love until we both became strangers, living in the same house. But she had remained close to Daniel, closer than she ever was to me. "What about it?" I asked gently. Daniel leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other like a man discussing business rather than family. "You're not in it." He said it the same way someone might say it might rain today. Flat, casual. I blinked once, letting the words settle. "Well," I said after a moment, "that's her decision." He seemed almost disappointed by my calmness. "I just didn't want you to be shocked later," he continued. "Mom made it very clear before she passed. Everything goes to me." He said everything slowly, as if the word itself had weight. I nodded. Margaret had done very well for herself in the years after our divorce. She started a small real estate investment company that grew into something far bigger than anyone expected. By the time she passed 3 weeks ago, people were whispering numbers around town. $34 million, an amount so large it didn't feel real to someone like me. I had spent most of my life as a high school history teacher. Money had never been the center of my world. But something about the way Daniel watched my reaction unsettled me. "Did you expect something?" he asked. The question hung in the air longer than it should have. I shook my head slowly. "No, son, I didn't." That answer was the truth. But the truth has layers. What I expected wasn't money. What I expected was kindness. A phone call after Margaret died. A quiet conversation. A son who understood that losing someone, even an ex-wife, is still losing someone who once shared your entire life. Instead, the first real conversation Daniel had with me about his mother's death was about money. Or rather, about my lack of it. He stood up and adjusted his jacket. "We should leave soon," he said. "The lawyer's office is across town." I watched him gather his car keys, his phone, his expensive leather briefcase. He looked confident, almost cheerful. For a moment I saw a glimpse of the little boy who used to run across this same kitchen floor with scraped knees and messy hair, shouting for pancakes on Sunday mornings. That boy would hug me for no reason at all. This man didn't. "Daniel," I said quietly. He paused by the door. "Yes?" I studied his face for a moment. "You seem very sure about all of this." He smiled, and that smile was the first thing that truly hurt. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't angry. It was satisfied. "I am," he said. "Mom and I talked about it many times." He opened the door, letting the cool morning air drift into the kitchen. "You'll see when we get there." Then he stepped outside. I remained at the table for a moment longer, staring at the empty chair across from me. The house felt strangely quiet, not sad, just different, as if something invisible had shifted between us. I finished my coffee slowly, listening to the ticking of the old wall clock Margaret had bought at a flea market decades ago. Funny how objects stay loyal long after people change. When I finally stood and put on my coat, I felt something I couldn't quite name. Not anger, not fear, just a quiet feeling that the day ahead would reveal more about my son than about any will. And somehow I already knew I wouldn't like what I saw. The lawyer's office was colder than I expected. Not just the temperature, the feeling of it. Tall windows lined one side of the room, letting in pale afternoon light that bounced off polished wooden shelves filled with thick legal books, the kind that looked like they held secrets no one ever wanted to read. Daniel walked ahead of me with the confident stride of a man who believed the day belonged to him. I followed more slowly. At 71, I had learned something important about moments like these. Rushing never changes the outcome. Time reveals things whether you hurry it or not. A young assistant greeted us and led us into a long conference room. At the center sat a dark oak table large enough for 10 people, though only 3 chairs were prepared, one for the lawyer, one for Daniel, and one for me. The lawyer stood as we entered. "Mr. Harrison," he said politely, shaking my hand. "I'm Richard Wells. I handled Margaret's estate." His handshake was firm but gentle, the kind practiced by someone who spent most of his life delivering news people didn't always enjoy hearing. "Thank you for coming." Daniel pulled out his chair immediately, sitting down with a small sigh of anticipation. I noticed it right away. The excitement. He tried to hide it, but a father learns to read his child's expressions long before that child learns to hide them. And Daniel had always been terrible at hiding joy, even when the reason for that joy wasn't something to be proud of. The lawyer opened a thick folder and adjusted his glasses. "As you both know," he began calmly, "Margaret Harrison passed away 3 weeks ago. Today, we will formally read her last will and testament." His voice carried the steady rhythm of someone who had done this many times. But for me, each word felt strangely personal. Margaret's name echoed in the room like a memory I wasn't prepared to face. We had been married for 26 years. 26 years of birthdays, arguments, quiet evenings, and raising a son together. It's strange how an entire life together can eventually become a stack of papers on a lawyer's desk. Daniel leaned forward slightly. His fingers rested neatly on the table, but his foot tapped quietly beneath the chair. Impatience. The lawyer began reading. Margaret's words sounded formal, distant, as legal language always does. There were paragraphs about property, investments, and charitable donations. A portion went to a medical research foundation, another to the university where she had studied business years ago. Daniel listened politely, but without real interest. Those parts weren't what he had been waiting for. Then came the section about family. I felt Daniel shift in his seat. The lawyer cleared his throat gently. "To my beloved son, Daniel Harrison." Daniel's shoulders straightened. "I leave the primary portion of my estate, including financial accounts, investment properties, and business holdings." Daniel's lips curled slightly, not a large smile. But enough. Enough for a father to notice. The lawyer continued reading numbers and descriptions that sounded almost unreal when spoken aloud. Properties in 3 cities, investment funds, corporate shares. By the time he finished that portion, the room had grown very quiet. $34 million. Even hearing it summarized so calmly felt strange. Daniel finally leaned back in his chair, satisfied. There it was again. That expression, the one that said everything went exactly the way I expected. The lawyer closed one section of the document and turned the page. Daniel glanced at me briefly, almost casually, as if checking whether I had understood my place in this story. "You okay, Dad?" he asked quietly. His voice carried a strange mix of politeness and distance. I nodded. "I'm fine," and I meant it. Money had never been something I measured my life by, but something else had begun settling in my chest, a small, uncomfortable awareness. Not about the will, about my son. The lawyer continued reading through smaller instructions, personal items, a few remaining assets, final legal clarifications. Daniel had stopped paying attention. His mind was already somewhere else, planning, imagining, perhaps even calculating the life he believed had just begun. Then the lawyer paused, only for a second. But I noticed. Years of teaching teenagers had trained me to notice hesitation in people's voices, and this one was deliberate. He adjusted his glasses again and glanced down at the final paragraph. Daniel sat up slightly. "What is it?" he asked with a small laugh. "Some legal formality?" The lawyer looked at him carefully. Just one final clause Margaret included. Daniel smiled. The kind of relaxed smile of a man already holding the prize. Go ahead, he said lightly. The lawyer looked back at the page, and for the first time since we entered the room, the silence around that table felt different. He cleared his throat and began reading the sentence that would quietly change everything. The lawyer adjusted the paper in front of him and read the final paragraph slowly. I would like to include one personal clause, he began, his voice softer now. Not a legal requirement, but a request that reflects my wishes clearly. Daniel leaned back in his chair again, relaxed. He even let out a small breath through his nose, almost amused. I folded my hands on the table and listened. To my son, Daniel, the lawyer continued, I leave the majority of my estate with the expectation that he will understand the responsibility that comes with it. Daniel nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already knew, but the lawyer wasn't finished. There is, however, one condition. Daniel's smile faded just a little. A condition? He asked. The lawyer didn't respond immediately. He simply continued reading. My former husband, Thomas Harrison, spent much of his life giving to his students, to his community, and to our family. While our marriage ended, his character never did. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. Margaret had always been good with words, but hearing her voice again, even through legal language, felt strange, familiar, distant. Daniel shifted in his seat. The lawyer continued. Because of this, I leave one instruction for my son. Daniel leaned forward. His fingers tapped the table again. What instruction? He asked, a small edge entering his voice. The lawyer read the final sentence. For Daniel to receive full control of my estate, he must first offer his father a home, care for him with dignity in his later years, and ensure he is never left alone or unsupported. The words settled in the room like quiet dust. Daniel blinked. Once, then again. I'm sorry, he said quickly. What does that mean exactly? The lawyer folded his hands calmly. It means the estate is legally yours, Daniel, he explained, but the transfer of full control is conditional. Daniel frowned. Conditional how? Richard Wells looked down at the will again and quoted Margaret directly. You must provide your father a permanent place in your household or a residence fully paid for by the estate. Additionally, documentation must confirm his care and financial security. Daniel stared at him. And if I don't? The lawyer's voice remained calm. Then the estate is placed into a trust managed by the foundation Margaret selected. Your father would receive a comfortable stipend for life, and the rest would be distributed to charitable causes. Daniel's chair scraped lightly against the floor as he sat back. That's ridiculous, he muttered. I remained still, not because I was shocked, but because something inside me had already begun to understand. Daniel looked at me. Did you know about this? I shook my head slowly. No. His jaw tightened. So Mom leaves everything to me, but only if I take care of you. The lawyer corrected him gently. She asked that you treat him with dignity and ensure his well-being. Daniel laughed softly, not a joyful laugh, the kind people use when something ruins their expectations. This is unbelievable. The room went quiet again. I looked down at my hands. They were older than I remembered. Wrinkles where time had folded the skin, faint spots where the sun had left its mark. Hands that had graded thousands of essays, fixed broken toys, cooked dinners, paid bills, held a small boy who once cried because his goldfish died. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. So basically, he said slowly, if I don't take him in, I lose control of everything. The lawyer nodded once. That is correct. Daniel looked at me again. This time the expression was different. Not satisfied, not confident, calculating. And that was the moment I finally understood Margaret's last decision. She hadn't written that clause to punish Daniel, and she hadn't written it to help me. She had written it to reveal something, the truth about the man our son had become. Daniel drummed his fingers on the table again. This is manipulative, he said quietly. No one answered. After a long moment, he stood up and began pacing near the window. $34 million sat quietly inside that folder on the table. But the real weight in the room wasn't money. It was choice. Daniel stopped walking and turned toward me. "Well, Dad," he said, forcing a small smile, "looks like Mom wanted us to stick together after all." His words sounded polite, but something in his tone felt heavy, like a business agreement forming behind his eyes. And as I watched my son standing there in that expensive suit, staring at me like a problem he needed to solve, a quiet thought passed through my mind. For the first time that day, I wondered if Margaret had left that clause not to protect me, but to give me a chance to see the truth clearly before it was too late. The drive home from the lawyer's office was quiet. Daniel insisted on driving, though he said very little after we left the building. His hand stayed tight on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if the traffic lights had suddenly become the most complicated things in the world. I watched the city pass by through the window, people walking their dogs, a young couple pushing a stroller, an old man watering flowers outside a small shop. Ordinary life moving forward without any knowledge of the strange weight sitting inside that car. $34 million had just become a question, not an answer. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "So," he said carefully, "we should probably talk about this." I turned my head slightly toward him. "Yes," I said gently, "we probably should." He nodded once, still looking forward. "Well, I mean, Mom clearly expected us to figure something out." There it was again. That tone. Practical, measured, not emotional, as if we were discussing a contract instead of a life. "I suppose she did," I replied. He drove another block before continuing. "You know I have a pretty busy life, Dad." "I know. My work keeps me traveling a lot." "I understand. And my house isn't exactly designed for another person right now." I waited. Years of teaching had taught me something important. When people are building toward a point, silence helps them reveal it faster. Daniel sighed. "But obviously," he added quickly, "I want to do the right thing." Those words sounded nice, but they felt rehearsed. He glanced at me briefly. "You could move into the guest room," he continued, "at least for now." I smiled softly. "Daniel," I said, "you don't have to solve this today." "But we kind of do," he replied quickly. "The lawyer said the paperwork starts soon." Of course it did. Paperwork always followed money, but something inside me had already become very calm. Strangely calm. "I've been thinking," I said. Daniel glanced over again. "And? I don't think I'll be moving in with you." The car slowed slightly. "What?" I said, "I don't think I'll be moving in with you." He stared at the road, confused. "But that's the condition." "Yes. If you don't live with me, I lose control of the estate." That's what the lawyer explained. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Dad, this isn't about control. It's about what Mom wanted." I turned toward him fully now. "Is it?" He didn't answer. We stopped at a red light. For the first time since the lawyer's office, Daniel looked directly at me. "You're seriously saying you'd walk away from all that money?" I smiled again. "Daniel," I said softly, "it was never my money." He shook his head. "You'd have a house paid for, care, security. I already have those things. You live in a small 2-bedroom house, and I like it." The light turned green, but Daniel didn't move immediately. Cars behind us began honking. He pressed the gas and drove forward again, frustration rising in his voice. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," I said quietly. "I'm making it simpler." He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You realize if you refuse, millions go to charities instead of your own family?" "Yes." "That's crazy." I watched the familiar streets leading back toward my neighborhood, the old bakery on the corner, the park where Daniel used to play baseball as a boy, places that held memories money could never buy. "Your mother understood something important," I said gently. "What?" "That love cannot be negotiated." Daniel gripped the steering wheel again. "This isn't about love." "I know." That was the problem. We pulled into my driveway. The little house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Simple. Quiet. Home. Daniel turned off the engine but didn't move. "So that's it?" he asked. "You're just refusing?" I opened the car door slowly. "I'm giving you freedom," I said. "Freedom?" "Yes. Freedom to decide who you want to be without using me as a condition." He stared at me, trying to understand. I stepped out of the car and leaned down slightly toward the open window. "Money reveals people," I told him calmly, "but it doesn't have to define them." Daniel said nothing. I closed the door gently and walked toward my front porch. Halfway to the door, I heard the car engine start again. I didn't turn around. Some lessons need silence to grow. Inside the house, the old wall clock ticked steadily, just as it had that morning. I sat down at the kitchen table and poured myself another cup of coffee. For the first time that day, I felt something settle peacefully inside me. Margaret hadn't left me millions, but she had left me something far more valuable: the chance to keep my dignity. And sometimes, the greatest inheritance a person can receive is the freedom to walk away with their self-respect intact.